In 1941, the Glenn L. Martin Company delivered a machine that looked less like a bomber and more like a torpedo with wings. The B-26 Marauder. It was sleek. It was streamlined. It was powered by two massive Pratt & Whitney RA-2800 double Wasp engines, the same engines used in the Corsair and the Thunderbolt fighter planes. It was designed for one thing: speed. To achieve that speed, the designers made a radical choice. They gave the bomber tiny, stubby wings. This reduced drag, allowing the plane to hit speeds of over 300 miles per hour, faster than many fighters of the day. But it also created a monster. The small wings meant the wing loading, the amount of weight each square foot of wing had to support, was dangerously high. To stay in the air, the B-26 had to fly fast. Specifically, it had to land fast. Most bombers of the era landed at a comfortable 90 or 100 miles per hour. The B-26 came over the fence at 130 miles per hour or more. For young American pilots, fresh out of flight school where they had flown forgiving trainers, the B-26 was a shock. If the engine coughed on takeoff, the plane would flip over and crash. If the pilot slowed down too much on the final approach, the wings would stall instantly. The plane wouldn't glide, it would drop like a stone. The training base at MacDill Field in Tampa, Florida, became a scene of daily carnage. So many B-26 crashed into the water surrounding the airfield that a grim rhyme began to circulate among the terrified cadets, one a day in Tampa Bay. They called the plane the Widowmaker. They called it the Martin Murderer. They called it the Flying Prostitute because it had no visible means of support, wings. Crews tried to transfer out of B-26 units. They were scared of their own machine. Civilian ferry pilots refused to fly them. A Senate committee, led by Harry Truman, investigated the program and seriously considered scrapping the entire production run. It seemed that the B-26 was a failure, a plane too hot for any human to handle safely. The Germans, reading reports of these crashes in the press, noted with satisfaction that the Americans had built a death trap. They didn't realize that the flaw was actually a feature waiting to be unlocked. The controversy over the B-26 came down to a misunderstanding of aerodynamics. The Martin engineers hadn't made a mistake. They had made a trade-off. They built the B-26 to survive in a hostile sky where speed was the only armor. They reasoned that a slow bomber was a dead bomber. So, they sacrificed low-speed handling for high-speed performance. The fuselage was a masterpiece of structural engineering. It was a semi-monocoque design, incredibly strong and rigid. It was built like a tank. It had a tricycle landing gear, one of the first bombers to use it, which gave it better visibility on the ground, but also required a different takeoff technique. The armor protection for the crew was heavy. The self-sealing fuel tanks were robust. But the pilots couldn't see past the landing speed. The landing gear struts were stiff. If you slammed the plane onto the runway, which terrified pilots often did, the nose gear would collapse, or the struts would punch through the wings. The propellers were huge, four-bladed electric props that were complex to manage. If the electrical system failed, the props could go into flat pitch, acting like giant air brakes, causing the plane to fall out of the sky. The learning curve was vertical. In 1942, the Army Air Forces were expanding rapidly. They were taking 19-year-old kids who had driven nothing faster than a tractor and putting them in the cockpit of a high-performance, twin-engine racer loaded with bombs. It was a recipe for disaster. The instructors were often just as inexperienced as the students. Myths and rumors replaced proper training manuals. "Don't bank past 15 degrees or you'll spin," they whispered. "Don't fly on one engine." These myths paralyzed the pilots. They flew the plane timidly. And the B-26 did not tolerate timidity. It killed the hesitant. While the Americans were struggling to master their own invention, the aircraft began to deploy to England and North Africa. It arrived with a reputation that smelled of burning aluminum and funeral flowers. The crews were demoralized before they even saw the enemy. And the enemy was waiting. When the B-26 finally entered combat in the European theater, the initial tactics were suicidal. The generals looked at the B-26 speed and decided it should be a low-level raider. Deck-level attacks. They ordered the pilots to fly at 50 feet, skimming the wavetops and treetops, to avoid German radar. They were sent to attack heavily defended targets, U-boat pens, power stations, and airfields. The disaster that followed seemed to confirm every fear the crews had. On May 17, 1943, a force of 11 B-26 from the 322nd Bombardment Group took off from England. Their target, the power stations at IJmuiden and Haarlem in the Netherlands. They crossed the North Sea at wavetop height. But the Germans were ready. Their coastal flak batteries, 20 mm and 37 mm guns, didn't need radar to see a bomber flying at 100 feet. The German gunners simply depressed their barrels and fired horizontally. It was a slaughter. The flak tore the B-26 apart. And then the fighters arrived. Focke-Wulf 190 swooped down on the low-flying bombers. The B-26 had no room to maneuver. They couldn't dive to escape speed because they were already on the ground. They couldn't climb because they would be slow targets. One by one, they were swatted out of the sky. Of the 11 bombers that took off, 0 returned. Every single plane was shot down. Every crewman was killed or captured. It was a 100% loss rate. The shockwave went through the 8th Air Force. The Widowmaker had lived up to its name. It seemed to be a flying coffin that delivered American boys directly into German graves. Operations were halted. The B-26 was grounded. There was serious talk of withdrawing the type from Europe entirely and scrapping the program. The German propaganda machine had a field day. They broadcasted the victory, claiming the American bombers were clay pigeons. They laughed at the incompetence of a command that would send medium bombers into the teeth of the Atlantic Wall at treetop height. They believed they had broken the back of the American medium bomber force. In the summer of 1943, the German Luftwaffe pilots felt a sense of superiority over the Marauder. They analyzed the wrecks of the IJmuiden raid. They saw the short wings. They saw the high wing loading. "This plane is a joke," the German aces said in their mess halls. "It cannot turn. It cannot glide. If you shoot out one engine, it flips over." They mocked the American engineering. They viewed the B-26 as a symptom of American production over quality, a rushed, dangerous design that killed its own crews. German fighter tactics against the B-26 were aggressive. They knew the B-26 had defensive guns, a top turret, a tail gun, and waist guns, but they weren't afraid of them. They believed that if they damaged the B-26 just a little bit, damaged a wing surface or an engine, the plane's unstable aerodynamics would finish the job for them. They treated the Marauder with contempt. When they saw a formation of B-26, they didn't see a threat, they saw a scoreboard padding opportunity. The German flak gunners, too, were confident. They knew the Americans were flying low, right into the engagement envelope of their light cannons. The B-26 was the laughingstock of the Western Front. But the Germans made a critical error. They assumed the Americans would keep doing the same thing. They assumed the Widowmaker reputation was a permanent feature of the aircraft, rather than a symptom of bad training and bad tactics. They didn't know that the Americans were learning. They didn't know that a new strategy was being devised, one that would take the B-26 out of the reach of the light flak and turn its speed into an invincible shield. The laughter in the Luftwaffe mess halls was about to die out, replaced by the frustration of chasing a bomber that was simply too fast and too tough to kill. The Widowmaker was about to become the German killer. The B-26 was on the chopping block. The crews were terrified. The press was calling it a scandal. To save the plane, the Army Air Forces called in a legend, Jimmy Doolittle. Doolittle was already a hero for his raid on Tokyo. He was also an aeronautical engineer with a PhD from MIT. He didn't fear machines, he understood them. He arrived at the B-26 training bases to conduct a personal investigation. He flew the plane himself. He realized immediately that the plane wasn't flawed, the training was. The pilots were treating it like a slow, forgiving Piper Cub when they should have been flying it like a high-performance fighter. To prove his point, Doolittle staged a series of demonstrations that became legendary. He gathered the terrified student pilots on the tarmac. He climbed into a B-26. He taxied out and roared down the runway. Just as the wheels left the ground, the most critical and dangerous moment of flight, Doolittle killed one engine. The crowd gasped. In a standard bomber, losing an engine on takeoff usually meant a cartwheel and a fireball. But Doolittle didn't crash. He feathered the dead propeller to reduce drag. He held the nose down to build speed. And then, on one engine, he flew the B-26 in a tight circle around the airfield, executed a perfect landing, and taxied back to the stunned students. He climbed out, smiling. "It's a fine airplane," he told them. "You just have to fly it." He ordered the training manuals rewritten. He commanded that pilots stop babying the throttle. "Fly it fast," he said. "Do not slow down until your wheels are on the concrete." He sent WASP, Women Air Force Service pilots, to ferry the planes, shaming the male pilots who were afraid to step into the cockpit. If a girl could fly the Widowmaker, surely a combat pilot could. The psychological tide began to turn. The crew stopped seeing the B-26 as a death trap and started seeing it as a hot ship. They realized that the heavy wing loading that made it dangerous to land also made it incredibly stable in the air. It cut through turbulence like a knife. It was a stable gun platform. It was fast enough to run away from trouble. Doolittle didn't change a single bolt on the airplane. He changed the minds of the men who flew it. He transformed fear into respect. The Widowmaker was still dangerous, but now it was in the hands of professionals who knew how to tame it. While Doolittle fixed the pilots, the tacticians in England fixed the mission. The disaster at Ijmuiden proved that low-level bombing was suicide. The B-26 was too big and too valuable to be used as a hedgehopper. The 9th Air Force made a radical decision: go up. They moved the B-26 from 50 feet to 12,000 feet. This was a medium altitude. It was a sweet spot. At 12,000 feet, the B-26 was completely out of range of the German light flak, the 20mm and 37mm automatic cannons that had shredded them at low level. But they were still low enough to bomb with incredible precision, far more accurately than the B-17s at 25,000 feet. At this altitude, the B-26's speed became its greatest defense against heavy flak, 88mm. The heavy German guns had to calculate the lead to hit a plane. They had to guess where the plane would be in 20 seconds. But the B-26 cruised at nearly 300 miles per hour. It moved across the sky so fast that the German gunners struggled to track it. By the time the 88mm shells exploded, the Marauders were already gone. The Americans also adopted the combat box formation. Flights of 6 planes flew in tight formation, their defensive guns overlapping. Unlike the B-17s, which relied on mass formations of hundreds of planes, the B-26 struck in smaller, faster groups. They would dash across the channel, hit a target, and race back before the Luftwaffe fighters could scramble and climb to intercept them. The German fighter pilots were frustrated. They were used to the slow, lumbering heavy bombers. When they tried to attack a B-26 formation, they found they couldn't just cruise up behind them. They had to push their engines to catch the furniture vans. And when they did catch them, they found the B-26 was a tough nut to crack. The Widowmaker had become the ghost. It struck fast, hit hard, and vanished. The German flak commanders watched their shells bursting harmlessly behind the tails of the speeding bombers and realized that the Americans had found a tactical loophole. They had found a way to bomb Europe without getting slaughtered. As 1944 approached, the mission of the B-26 changed again. The target was no longer factories, it was the invasion of Europe. The Allies needed to isolate the Normandy battlefield. They needed to destroy the bridges and rail yards to prevent the Germans from rushing reinforcements to the beaches. This required pinpoint accuracy. You can't destroy a bridge by carpet bombing the whole area, you have to hit the spans. The B-26 became the bridge buster. At 12,000 feet, using the Norden bomb sight, the Marauder crews achieved a level of accuracy that was unheard of. They boasted they could drop a bomb in a pickle barrel from 2 miles up. The results were devastating for the German logistics network. Across France and Belgium, railway bridges collapsed into rivers. Marshalling yards were turned into twisted steel. The Seine River bridges were systematically dropped, one by one. The German army was paralyzed. Trains carrying panzer divisions were stopped dead. Fuel trains burned. The German engineers tried to repair the bridges at night. The B-26 came back the next morning and knocked them down again. The Luftwaffe tried to defend these vital points, but they were stretched too thin. And the B-26 were too fast. They would hit a bridge in France and be back in England for lunch. Then they would rearm and hit a rail yard in Belgium for dinner. The operational tempo was exhausting for the Germans. The bridge busters earned a grim respect from the enemy. German generals complained that they couldn't move a single train in daylight. They were forced to march their troops on roads, where they were strafed by fighter bombers. The B-26 was the anvil upon which the German transportation network was smashed. It wasn't winning the war by leveling cities, it was winning by strangling the Wehrmacht. The accuracy of the Marauder meant that French civilian casualties were minimized compared to heavy bomber raids. It was a surgical instrument in a blunt force war. If there was one plane that symbolized the toughness of the Marauder, it was a flak bait. A B-26B of the 322nd Bombardment Group, the same group that had been wiped out at IJmuiden, now rebuilt and flying at medium altitude. Flak bait lived up to its name. It flew 207 combat missions. This is the record for any American bomber in the war. Think about that. A B-17 was considered lucky if it survived 25 missions. Flak bait survived 207. It didn't survive because it was hidden. It survived because it was tough. It came back from missions with over 1,000 holes in its fuselage. It came back with engines shot out. It came back with the hydraulic line severed, the bomb bay doors flapping in the wind. It came back with a German 20mm shell lodged in the instrument panel. It didn't explode. The German gunners threw everything they had at this plane. But the B-26 structure, the rigid fuselage, the heavy wing spars, absorbed the punishment. The armor plate protected the crew. Flak bait became a legend. The crew patched the holes with whatever metal they could find. The plane's skin looked like a quilt of aluminum patches. German pilots who attacked it must have wondered if it was a zombie aircraft. They would see pieces flying off it, smoke pouring from the engines, and yet it held its formation. It dropped its bombs. And it flew home. The survival of flak bait proved that the Widowmaker reputation was a lie. Once the tactics were fixed, the B-26 was the safest place to be in the sky. It brought its crews home when other planes would have disintegrated. The nose of flak bait sits in the Smithsonian today, still wearing its original, battered paint. It is a testament to the engineering that the Germans mocked, the heavy, clumsy American design that turned out to be indestructible. The Germans had spent the war trying to shoot it down. They failed. By 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter pilots were noticing something frustrating about engaging the B-26. They couldn't catch it. Or rather, they couldn't catch it easily. Attacking a formation of B-17 flying fortresses was a calculated affair. The heavy bombers cruised at about 160 miles per hour. A German fighter pilot had plenty of time to set up his attack run, calculate his lead, and fire. The B-26 Marauder cruised at nearly 280 miles per hour. In a shallow dive, it could hit 350. For a German pilot in a Bf-109, this speed difference was a tactical nightmare. The closer rate was too low if attacking from behind, and too high if attacking from the front. If a German pilot tried to attack from the rear, he had to push his engine to full military power just to close the distance. He would be burning precious fuel, vibrating, and presenting a steady target for the B-26 tail gunner. If he tried a beam attack from the side, the B-26 flashed past so quickly that the window for firing was a fraction of a second. It was a problem of geometry. The German pilots found themselves constantly lagging, shooting behind the target because they misjudged its speed. The American crews realized that their engines were their best defense. Speed is armor, the saying went. A fast-moving target is harder to hit. A fast-moving formation spends less time over enemy territory. The B-26 could strike a target deep in France and be back across the channel before the German interceptors could even reach their altitude. The Germans had mocked the stubby wings that required such high speeds. They didn't realize those wings were the reason the bombers were surviving. That Martin Murderer was running circles around the hunters. June 5, 1944. The night before D-Day. On airfields across England, a strange ritual was taking place. Thousands of ground crews were rushing out to the flight lines with buckets of paint and brushes. They were painting invasion stripes, 3 white and 2 black bands, on the wings and fuselages of every Allied aircraft. The B-26 groups were at the center of this activity. The sheer number of marauders was staggering. By now, the 9th Air Force had hundreds of them. The mission for D-Day morning was critical: Utah Beach. The heavy bombers, B-17s, were assigned to Omaha Beach. They bombed from high altitude through cloud cover. Fearing they would hit their own troops, they delayed their drops. Their bombs fell miles inland, leaving the German defenses on Omaha intact. The result was a bloodbath. At Utah Beach, the B-26 came in. They flew lower. They flew faster. They flew under the clouds. They dropped 4,404 bombs on the German shore batteries minutes before the landing craft hit the sand. The accuracy was deadly. The German bunkers were smashed. The defenders were concussed and demoralized. The U.S. 4th Infantry Division landed at Utah with relatively light casualties compared to the horror at Omaha. The B-26 crews looked down and saw the invasion fleet, the greatest armada in history. They saw the black and white stripes on their own wings reflecting off the water. The Germans looked up and saw the sky filled with the twin-engine silhouettes they had once laughed at. But nobody was laughing now. The B-26 had delivered the army to the beach. It had kicked open the door to Fortress Europe. The Widowmaker had become the beachbreaker. After the breakout from Normandy, the war became a rout. The German army was retreating east, trying to escape the Falaise pocket and cross the Seine. This was the B-26 hunting ground. The German columns were stuck on the few remaining roads. Trucks, tanks, horse-drawn artillery, all jammed bumper to bumper. The B-26 roamed overhead like sharks. They didn't just bomb bridges anymore. They bombed choke points. They bombed crossroads. They trapped the Germans in killing boxes. The German soldiers on the ground learned to fear the twin-engine drone. They knew that the B-26 didn't miss. When the bomb bay doors opened, the soldiers abandoned their vehicles and ran for the ditches. The German supply lines evaporated. Fuel couldn't get to the front because the B-26 had destroyed the fuel trains. Ammo couldn't get to the tanks. The Luftwaffe was powerless to stop them. Their airfields had been bombed by the marauders. Their fuel dumps were burning. The B-26 crews were flying 2 missions a day. They were exhausted, but they were winning. They flew over the wreckage of the German army, miles of twisted steel and burning rubber. They saw the result of their work. The plane that was supposed to be a failure had dismantled the Wehrmacht's ability to move. The German officers who had mocked the American production over quality's mindset were now walking back to Germany on foot, dodging bombs dropped by mass-produced American planes. The B-26 was the instrument of their destruction. It was the hammer that drove the nail into the coffin of the Third Reich. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the statisticians went to work. They compiled the combat records of every aircraft type flown by the U.S. Army Air Forces. They looked at the B-17 Flying Fortress. It had suffered terribly. Loss rates hovered around 4.5% per mission in the early days. Thousands of airmen died. They looked at the B-24 Liberator. Similar numbers. High casualties. Then they looked at the Martin B-26 Marauder. The numbers didn't seem right. They checked them again. The plane that was called the Widowmaker, the plane that pilots were too scared to fly, the plane the Senate wanted to scrap. It had the lowest combat loss rate of any significant U.S. bomber in the European theater of operations. Less than 0.5%, 0.5%. It was a statistical miracle. How? The speed made it hard to intercept. The rugged construction made it hard to shoot down. The medium-altitude tactics kept it out of the worst flak. The German pilots had mocked it, but they couldn't kill it. The B-26 flew more than 110,000 sorties. It dropped 150,000 tons of bombs. It brought its crews home when other planes would have fallen. The pilots who had once tried to transfer out of B-26 units now wore their patches with fierce pride. They knew the truth. That flaw of the small wings was actually the secret to survival. The high speed that made landing dangerous was the same speed that saved them over the target. The Germans had underestimated the American capacity to adapt. They saw a difficult machine and assumed it was a bad machine. They didn't realize that in the hands of trained crews, a difficult machine can be a masterpiece. As the B-26 were scrapped after the war, ironically, very few were preserved. Their legacy was secured in the cold, hard numbers of survival. The Germans laughed at the design. But the B-26 crews got the last laugh, because they lived to tell the tale.